What if I told you there was once a king whose very body became a living omen of decay, a ruler so disfigured by nature that his subjects whispered he must be cursed by forces darker than the grave? This was not some medieval peasant shunned from a village, nor a forgotten outcast hidden away in a monastery. This was the man who sat upon the throne of Spain, the most powerful empire in the world. His name was Charles II, and when foreign dignitaries first laid eyes on him, they recoiled in disbelief. This was the king who ruled vast lands stretching across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Yet when he entered a room, what they saw was not majesty, but horror. His people did not call him noble, or mighty, or even wise. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. But here is the chilling truth. Charles II was not the victim of demons, nor cursed by witches. His affliction was far more insidious, the result of centuries of deliberate choices by his own dynasty. The Habsburgs family had ruled Europe with an iron grip, their name feared across battlefields and royal courts alike. Yet their obsession with keeping their bloodline pure, marrying cousins, uncles, nieces, twisting family trees into circles, slowly corroded the very foundation of their power. In Charles, that centuries long experiment reached its dreadful conclusion. He was not a king born of strength. He was a broken vessel, a living warning of what happens when human ambition defies nature itself. Imagine the first time a foreign ambassador bowed before him. The great throne room of Madrid glittered with golden chandeliers and silken banners. Courtiers lined the walls in their finest robes. The herald announced His Majesty, Charles II of Spain, and then into this dazzling hall shuffled a figure who seemed less like a monarch and more like the shadow of one. His head was disproportionately large, his body frail and twisted. But what transfixed everyone, what froze smiles upon the faces of even seasoned diplomats, was his jaw. It jutted so far forward that his mouth could not fully close. His lips never met. His teeth, mismatched and crooked, gaped open like a broken gate. When he tried to smile, the effect was grotesque, and when he tried to speak, his words came out as a garbled murmur, almost impossible to decipher. This deformity had a name whispered in every European court: the Habsburg jaw. It was not unique to Charles. His ancestors had worn the same curse upon their faces, but in him it reached its terrible climax. To understand the torment, you must picture what life was like for him each day. He could not chew solid food. Everything he ate had to be prepared like porridge, mashed and pureed by palace kitchens. Even then, meals were humiliations more than nourishment. Soups and broths dribbled from the corners of his mouth. Solid food spilled down his chin. Servants hovered constantly, wiping at his lips like attendants to an infant. Royal banquets, meant to impress the world with Spanish grandeur, became spectacles of pity, where the most powerful man in Europe could not even eat with dignity. But eating was only part of the torment. The deformity warped his speech, slurring his words until even his closest advisers struggled to understand him. Foreign ambassadors often required interpreters, not because of language barriers, but because they could not make sense of his mumbled commands. Imagine that for a moment. The King of Spain, commander of fleets and armies, reduced to a figure whose own decrees had to be translated into clarity. His own mother confessed in private letters her terror that he might choke to death in his sleep. His tongue slipping back into his throat. To his people, their monarch was a living paradox, crowned by God, yet fragile as a sick child, an emperor whose every breath seemed a miracle or a curse. And yet, the jaw was only the beginning. The true horror of Charles II was his entire body, a frame twisted as though nature itself had tried to warn the Habsburgs that their dynasty was rotting from within. Charles did not walk until he was 8 years old. 8. While other children were racing through palace gardens, chasing tutors, and learning to fence with wooden swords, the heir to the Spanish throne was still crawling, unable to bear his own weight. When he finally did take steps, it was not with the grace of a prince, but with the stumbling shuffle of an old man, clutching at walls and furniture for support. His spine curved unnaturally, hunching him forward as though he carried a burden too heavy for his frame. His head loomed massive above a weak and skeletal body, his neck straining under the weight of it. His limbs were spindly, his chest compressed, his entire figure a grotesque distortion of proportion. Even as an adult, he barely reached 5 feet in height. He did not look like a king. He looked like a man trapped between childhood and decrepitude, a body refusing to grow, yet rushing to collapse. Court records describe how foreign visitors, upon seeing him, would glance away quickly, unwilling to stare, yet unable to forget the image burned into their minds. Some crossed themselves in private, whispering prayers, convinced they had seen not a monarch, but a man touched by the devil. And then there was his mind. The Habsburgs had not only warped his body, they had broken his intellect as well. Charles could not read until the age of 10, and even then, his tutors despaired at how little he understood. They described teaching him as pouring water into a cracked vessel. Everything simply leaked away. He would throw tantrums like a toddler when denied what he wanted, screaming, thrashing, breaking into violent fits of rage. Then, without warning, he would fall into eerie silences, sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing, his eyes glazed over. He was both unpredictable and pitiful, a ruler who could never truly rule. Yet the Habsburg court could not admit this. Spain needed its king, and so they wrapped Charles in layers of pomp and ceremony, disguising his frailty with velvet robes, elaborate portraits, and staged processions. Court painters did their best to flatter him, to soften the jaw, to disguise the weakness of his frame, but even their artistry could not erase the truth. Behind the gilded throne sat a man who was, in every sense, broken. This was the heir that generations of power-hungry marriages had produced, and the Habsburgs knew it. They had seen the warning signs long before Charles was born. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents, uncle and niece. His family tree did not branch. It coiled in upon itself, like a serpent devouring its own tail. By the time Charles entered the world, his genetic makeup resembled not the vibrant diversity of a kingdom, but the suffocating isolation of a deserted island. His very existence was proof that their obsession with purity had instead created ruin. And yet, Charles was not merely a personal tragedy. His frailty was a political disaster waiting to ignite. For all his deformities, he was still King of Spain, and with that crown came the single greatest responsibility a monarch could hold, to produce an heir. But Charles could not. His body, already ravaged by deformities, betrayed him in the most fateful way of all. His reproductive organs were underdeveloped, childlike, incapable of fulfilling their most basic function. Spain had a king who could not father children, a dynasty collapsing from the inside out. His first marriage to the young and beautiful Marie Louise of Orleans was a nightmare. She arrived in Madrid full of hope, expecting to wed a king of power and prestige. Instead, she found herself bound to a man whose body was so distorted, whose voice so slurred, whose touch so feeble, that palace whispers wondered whether he was even truly a man at all. On their wedding night, servants waited outside the chamber for signs of success. What emerged was not triumph, but humiliation. Marie Louise wept. Charles, confused and distressed, could not perform the duty expected of him. For years, the court blamed her, accusing her of barrenness, subjecting her to endless medical humiliations, forcing her to drink foul concoctions and endure invasive treatments. Yet the truth was crueler. It was not the queen who was barren. It was the king. Marie Louise wasted away under the pressure. Her once bright spirit dulled into despair. She died at the age of 26, her body broken not by poison or blade, but by hopelessness. Charles remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but nothing changed. The dynasty's desperate prayers went unanswered. No heir would ever come. And as Europe looked on, waiting, calculating, preparing for the inevitable death of a childless king, whispers in Spain grew darker still. If medicine could not explain Charles, then perhaps he was bewitched after all. Perhaps demons walked the halls of the Escorial, clutching at the body of their monarch. And soon, the Spanish court would attempt something so bizarre, so desperate, that history still struggles to comprehend it. They would drag their king into ceremonies meant to purge the devil himself from his flesh. Public exorcisms, performed in the royal palace before the eyes of nobles and foreign dignitaries, where the most powerful man in Spain would writhe, convulse, and scream as priests chanted over him. And if you think that sounds unimaginable, just wait, because what those priests claimed to discover inside Charles II would shock not only Spain, but all of Europe. The whispers had grown unbearable. By the late 1690s, Spain's greatest physicians had failed. Foreign doctors had been summoned from France, Italy, and the German states, all hoping to find some hidden remedy that might restore their king. But every treatment ended in the same despair. Charles II continued to weaken, his body crumbling, his mind slipping further into confusion. And so, when medicine failed, the Spanish court turned to the only other power they believed could explain the unexplainable: the church. The theory was simple, terrifying, and utterly medieval. Charles was not merely sick, he was bewitched, possessed by devils who had lodged themselves deep inside his frail body. If he could not be cured by doctors, perhaps he could be cleansed by priests. And so began one of the most surreal and disturbing chapters in royal history. The exorcisms of Charles II were not quiet affairs, whispered in hidden chapels away from prying eyes. They were public theater, staged in the very throne room of the palace. Nobles, courtiers, even foreign dignitaries were summoned to watch as their king, dressed not in royal finery, but in simple garments, was dragged before the altar like a penitent sinner. The priests stood ready, crucifixes in hand, bowls of holy water at their sides, voices sharpened for battle. Father Froilan Diaz, the court's chief exorcist, declared with certainty that Charles was inhabited by dozens of demons, each gnawing at a different part of his body. Some, he claimed, clouded his mind, others twisted his bones, others still sealed his loins so that he could never sire a child. And then the ritual began. Holy water was forced down the king's throat, mixed with fragments of relics, ground into powder. Charles gagged, convulsed, vomited violently as priests shouted that the devils were resisting. They pressed crucifixes against his skin until he cried out in pain. They commanded him to speak in Latin prayers, a language he could barely comprehend. And as the king writhed on the floor of his own throne room, his courtiers watched in silence, horror etched across their faces. But it did not stop there. Father Diaz convinced the court that not only the king, but the entire palace was infested. Furniture, gifts, tapestries, even the personal belongings of queens long dead, all were suspected of harboring witchcraft. In 1698, a great bonfire roared in the courtyard of the royal palace as these items were burned to ash, while priests marched in circles, chanting exorcisms. Smoke filled the night sky as Madrid's citizens gathered outside the palace gates, whispering prayers and crossing themselves. Their king, once believed to be chosen by God, was now reduced to a desperate spectacle of superstition. The exorcisms escalated further. At one point, Father Diaz claimed he had expelled not one or two, but 47 separate demons from Charles's body. Each, he said, had a name and a purpose. One whispered confusion into his speech. Another stole strength from his legs. Another clouded his seed so that it could never bear fruit. When the priests finished, Charles lay collapsed, pale and trembling, unable to speak for 3 days. And yet, the courtiers noted something chilling. In his childlike mind, Charles believed he truly thought the demons were inside him and that their rituals offered relief. He begged for more exorcisms, submitting himself again and again to rituals that wrung what little strength remained in him. But no demon had cursed Charles II. His enemy was within his blood itself, in every twisted thread of his lineage. And that enemy was winning. By 1699, Charles was only 38 years old, yet his body was failing, as though he were an old man on the edge of death. He spent days bedridden, barely able to rise, his mind wandering in confused fits of paranoia and despair. He saw visions, spoke of curses, feared poison in his meals. The court whispered more urgently than ever. Everyone knew the inevitable was near. Spain would soon be without a king, without an heir. And when Charles finally closed his eyes, the dynasty that had ruled for centuries would collapse with him. When the end came, it was not glorious, nor even peaceful. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, took his final breath. He was 38 years old, though his body had long resembled something far older. The man they called El Hechizado had lived his life as a shadow of a king, and now that shadow finally vanished. But his death was not the end of the horror, for what followed was an examination that revealed truths so ghastly, so beyond comprehension, that the official report was at first suppressed. Yet the details slipped into the whispers of Europe, spreading like fire, confirming every fear his subjects had long held. The autopsy of Charles II was carried out by royal physicians who peeled back the fragile veil of his body and discovered a nightmare within. His heart was shriveled, no larger than a walnut, blackened and wasted, as though burned from the inside. His lungs were corroded, eaten by decay, filled with fluids and rotting tissue, that released such a foul stench that assistants fled the chamber. His intestines were described as putrid, gangrenous, rotting even while he still lived. The reproductive organs, so central to Spain's agony, were underdeveloped to the point of being childlike, incapable of producing life. And then they opened his skull. Inside, they found his brain floating in an abnormal sea of fluid, hydrocephalus, we would call it now. His brain tissue was discolored, damaged, a physical explanation for the confusion, the outbursts, the childlike behavior that had haunted his reign. The physician, Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pinheiro, concluded his report with words that sent a shiver across Europe. It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, for it contained not a single sound organ, not one, not a single healthy organ within him. His entire body was a ruin, a grotesque monument to centuries of inbreeding, a living experiment in what happens when the pursuit of power defies nature itself. To the physicians, it was biology. To the courtiers, it was proof of witchcraft. For how else could such a monstrous vessel have walked the earth? How else could he have survived as long as he did, if not for dark forces sustaining him? The line between science and superstition blurred, and in Charles II, both seemed to meet in one man's suffering. His death tore open Europe. As predicted, the absence of an heir unleashed chaos. France, Austria, England, and countless others all claimed the throne, and the War of Spanish Succession erupted, a conflict that would rage for more than a decade, killing hundreds of thousands, redrawing the map of Europe and shifting the balance of power for generations. The dynasty that had once ruled with unshakable certainty collapsed into bloodshed, undone not by foreign invasion, but by its own obsession with purity. And so, Charles II remains not merely a tragic figure, but a symbol, a warning carved into history. His story forces us to confront a truth more terrifying than superstition. The greatest enemy of kings is not always revolt, or assassins, or war. Sometimes the enemy sits quietly within their own veins. The Habsburgs believed they could defy the natural order, bend bloodlines to their will, and create everlasting power. Instead, they created Charles, a king so broken, so deformed, so incapable of fulfilling the simplest duties of his crown, that his very existence destroyed the empire he was meant to preserve. And perhaps that is why his story lingers like a ghost across the pages of history. Because Charles II was not simply a man who died young, he was the embodiment of a dynasty's sins, carried to their inevitable conclusion. Every protruding inch of his jaw, every step he stumbled, every word he slurred, was not just his burden, but the weight of generations crushing him into the shape of a curse. So, the next time you hear tales of kings and queens, of golden crowns and mighty dynasties, remember Charles II of Spain. Remember that behind the portraits and palaces lies a truth that history too often hides, that power, when pursued without restraint, can rot not just nations, but flesh itself. If stories like this grip you, if the dark corners of history fascinate you as much as they haunt, then join me, subscribe, and step further into the shadows of the past with me, because there are countless more secrets waiting, buried in the bones of forgotten kings and cursed dynasties. And now, I want to hear from you. After hearing the story of Charles II, the bewitched king, Do you think his people were wrong to believe he was cursed? Or was he, in a sense, living proof that human ambition itself can summon horrors greater than any demon? Share your thoughts below.